Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today, we're journeying back to one of the most devastating periods in human history, the Middle Ages, specifically to confront the terror of the Black Death. Imagine a world where, in just a few short years, up to half the population of Europe simply vanished. It sounds like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie, but this was the grim reality of the mid-14th century. So, what exactly was the Black Death, and how did it bring an entire continent to its knees? The story begins not in Europe, but far to the east, in the arid plains of Central Asia. The culprit was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this bacterium lived relatively harmlessly within populations of rodents, like marmots. It was spread between them by fleas. But sometime in the early 1300s, something changed. Perhaps climate shifts or other environmental factors forced these rodents out of their natural habitats and into closer contact with humans and their animals. The fleas carrying the deadly bacteria now had new hosts. They jumped onto the black rats that infested trade caravans and merchant ships, and these rats were the ultimate stowaways of the medieval world. They traveled along the bustling Silk Road, the superhighway of its day, which connected Asia with the Middle East and Europe. By 1346, the plague had reached the shores of the Black Sea at a thriving Genoese trading post called Kaffa. What happened next is a horrifying tale of early biological warfare. The city was under siege by a Mongol army, and as the plague began to ravage the besieging forces, their leader had a gruesome idea. He ordered the infected corpses to be catapulted over the city walls. Panic-stricken, the Genoese merchants fled, taking to their ships to escape, but they weren't escaping alone. The rats and their deadly fleas were on board too. In October 1347, 12 of these death ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The people of Messina were horrified by what they saw. Most of the sailors aboard were either dead or gravely ill, covered in mysterious black boils that oozed blood and pus. The authorities quickly ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. From Sicily, the plague spread with terrifying speed. It was a perfect storm. Medieval Europe was densely populated. Cities were overcrowded and sanitation was virtually non-existent. Garbage and waste were thrown into the streets, creating a paradise for rats. The plague moved northward, following the major trade routes. It hit Marseille in France, Tunis in North Africa, and then Rome and Florence in Italy. By the summer of 1348, it had reached Paris, Bordeaux, and London. Within 5 years, it had swept through almost all of Europe, from the Mediterranean to Scandinavia, and as far east as Moscow. So what was it like to actually get the plague? Well, there were three main forms. The most common was the bubonic plague. This is the one that gave the Black Death its name. Victims would develop excruciatingly painful swellings or buboes in their lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes could grow to the size of an apple and would often turn black as the tissue died. This was accompanied by a high fever, chills, vomiting, and terrible aches. Without treatment, which didn't exist, the bubonic plague was fatal in about 50 to 80% of cases. Then there was the pneumonic plague. This was even more terrifying because it attacked the respiratory system and was spread directly from person to person through airborne droplets from coughing. It was almost 100% fatal, with death occurring within a day or two. Finally, the rarest and deadliest form was septicemic plague. This occurred when the bacteria multiplied directly in the bloodstream. It was so swift and lethal that victims often died before any symptoms even had a chance to develop. The people of the Middle Ages had no idea what was causing this catastrophe. Lacking any knowledge of germ theory, they came up with all sorts of explanations. Many believed it was a divine punishment from God for the sins of humanity. This led to a surge in religious fervor, processions of flagellants. People who would whip themselves publicly as a form of penance traveled from town to town, hoping to appease God's wrath. Ironically, their travels probably helped spread the disease even further. Others looked for earthly explanations. They blamed bad air or miasma, a poisonous vapor they believe was released from earthquakes or the alignment of planets. Doctors, wearing their famous beak-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, tried to purify the air with fires and incense. They prescribed treatments like bloodletting and boil lancing, which were not only ineffective but often made things worse. Tragically, fear and ignorance also led to the search for scapegoats. Jewish communities across Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells to spread the disease. This resulted in horrific massacres. Thousands of innocent people were tortured and burned alive despite a papal decree from Pope Clement VI stating their innocence. Society itself began to break down. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, wrote in the Decameron that the sick were abandoned by their neighbors, their relatives, and their friends. The living, in order to escape death, would flee from the sick. Doctors refused to see patients, priests refused to perform last rites, and parents abandoned their own children. Law and order collapsed as the people who were supposed to enforce it were either dead or had fled. Fields went unplowed, and harvests rotted, leading to widespread famine on top of the plague. But humans are resilient. Even in the face of such horror, life had to go on. In some places, communities tried to quarantine themselves, shutting their gates to outsiders. While this sometimes worked, it often just trapped the disease inside. People tried all sorts of folk remedies and charms, desperate for any sliver of hope. By 1351, the first and most vicious wave of the Black Death began to recede. But it wasn't gone for good. The plague would return in smaller, but still deadly outbreaks every decade or so for the next several centuries. The world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death was a profoundly different place. The demographic consequences were staggering. It's estimated that Europe lost somewhere between 30 and 60% of its total population. In some cities, the death toll was as high as 80%. It took Europe over 200 years for its population to recover to pre-plague levels. This massive loss of life, however, had some unexpected and transformative long-term effects. With so many people gone, there was a severe labor shortage. This meant that the surviving peasants and workers were suddenly in a much stronger bargaining position. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. The rigid feudal system, which had bound serfs to the land for centuries, began to crumble. Many serfs were able to buy their freedom or simply leave their manors in search of better opportunities. This shift in power from the landowning nobility to the common people was a crucial step towards the modern world. The church's authority was also weakened. Its inability to explain or stop the plague and the sight of many corrupt or cowardly clergymen led people to question its power. This sowed the seeds for the religious upheavals of the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. Furthermore, the focus on death and the afterlife spurred a new wave of art and thought. There was a move towards more realism in art, and a growing interest in science and medicine, as people sought more rational explanations for the world around them. Some historians argue that the shock of the Black Death helped to shake Europe out of the Middle Ages, and paved the way for the Renaissance. The Black Death was an unparalleled human tragedy, a story of fear, loss, and the fragility of civilization. But it's also a story of survival, resilience, and a testament to how even the darkest of times can lead to profound and lasting change, reshaping the very course of history. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. See you next time.